Welcome to a discussion of the literary canon. This is one of our opening segments in this literature course. And one of the things that we'll be doing the entire semester is determining, are these works canonical? Why are they canonical? Why do we study them? So we're going to define these terms and help you begin understanding why great literature is considered great literature and what you might include in it in the future. So let's get started. First, we need to define what the literary canon is. And in the shorter 11th edition of May's, the glossary defines it as the range of works that a consensus of scholars, teachers, and readers of a particular time and culture consider great or major. So think about that. Who is actually determining this? People who are educated in the area of literature. So when we talk about literature, though, we are talking about people who have come together to discuss the elements that make that literature great, but it's also very time dependent and culture dependent. What is going on during that historical time period? What is happening within the culture? What is the culture value during that time? So there are several different dimensions that we study when we consider the literary canon. The opening of May's introduction, same textbook, also discusses the literary canon as something defined as imaginative and creative, that has recognized artistic value. And so there becomes a problem that we'll talk about in a little bit of how do you measure that? What is one person's creativity may flop for other people. But what you're doing is, with this consensus of scholars, teachers, and readers, you're bringing these people who are educated in that area, who study this regularly and see the trends, but also see what has lived long in these areas. If something is new, is fresh, is different, but has great imagery or has great development, then that is likely to be something that would long-term be included in a literary canon. One other consideration with the literary canon, which I kind of see this question a little bit conflicting personally, is this reading for study and scholarship, or is this reading for entertainment and pleasure? And quite frankly, some of the things that you're reading in your literature class, you're studying it, and you're doing this so that you can take a class to meet credits for a college degree. You may not be reading that for true entertainment or pleasure. However, I am sure that a lot of what you read for the class or outside of class, you would consider more entertainment or pleasure reading, but it still might be considered canonical because of the way it's developed. So I hate for that to be an either or question throughout the course, or just period. I hate it to be an either or, because quite frankly, I read Jane Austen over the summer and that was my pleasure reading. It did happen to benefit my classes, but and so that study and scholarship, is linked in there. But I love her work. I mean, she wrote novels. They are very entertaining to me. But some of you would hate reading her. That would become an absolute the least entertaining thing that you could possibly do for some of you. So some of that is subjective, but there are things that we measure the canon or canonical works by that help us determine really what is its value, beyond just this idea of, hey man, I liked it or I didn't like it. So now the title of the screen is joining the canonical club. Is there really a canonical club? No. It's this impression, this idea of what is a great work. Okay, so I'm just being a little humorous here, but how does a person judge imaginativeness, creativeness, and artistic value? That is a good question. If you can answer that and actually be able to tell me how to measure that, then you should have an A for the class immediately. Because one person's imaginativeness can flop, and one person's creativeness can be genius to one person and just really poor to another. And so maybe the artistic value is coming in there. Maybe it's not just that I liked it, I didn't like it. Maybe it has other characteristics that add to it, like in a painting. So many people just think that Jackson Pollock is just horrible. I mean, it's splatter painting at its worst to the general onlooker. But to someone who's studied art, they can see his intentionalness of where he has placed some of the splatters, or they see something richer behind the way that he has placed that paint in certain areas on the canvas. So it's not just a bunch of, you know, co-eds or something going crazy with their splatter paint walls. It's actually a beautiful, rich composition with lots of layers and lots of tones on tone and a lot of contrast. So it means something different to people. So there's this idea of artistic value that comes into it, that just because you don't like it or that doesn't really go into, is this valuable to the canon? Because quite frankly, Jackson Pollock changed painting. So if we look at that with literature, there were lots of different literary movements during the 20th century that could be considered extremely imaginative, extremely creative. William Carlos Williams was using um, a lot of his poetry in order to mimic this idea of painting a picture, and how a poem can actually give form and symbolic meaning, and also represent something bigger just in a few lines even. Some people would say that his poetry is horrible just on face value of it. But once you actually understand and see what he's doing with the poem, you might say, oh, there really is something more to this red wheelbarrow that he's describing in this very brief poem. So as we go through the course, what I want you to look at is, as we're in the fiction and drama units, is there a rich or complex storyline? And even some of the poems that we're going to study are going to have a storyline to them. So what is the storyline? Is it fulfilled? If it is cut off, or if it doesn't extend to where we thought it was going to go, why did the author choose to do that? And how does that impact the way that we read? The character development, that again, all three genres, you're going to be looking at characters in some of these works. And you have to think about, how is this person developed? Is it cheesy, to make a very simplistic word out of it? Or is this person, if they are the villain, is there some complexity to the character? Or is the person this villain, period? Are there any redeemable characteristics? And if there are, why? Or if there aren't, why? And just because you land on one answer or another doesn't mean that that is the full answer. That means that that character is not canonical in itself. So is the plot, depending upon what genre it is, a realistic or an unrealistic plot might work or it might fall. Why is that realistic plot really good, or why is it not? An unrealistic plot is expected for fantasy. But if you're doing something that is on kind of on this line of realism, then if the characters are doing things that just don't seem right as a right fit for that character, and how the work progresses, then does it work or does it not? You just really have to look at all the things that surround that plot in order to determine whether a realistic or unrealistic development actually does work in that plot. And then a vivid or well integrated imagery can absolutely change a work in its entirety. And some of the works you'll actually go through and you'll understand finally that, okay, there is this picture of the worm, destructive worm in an apple, in a short story called The Destroyers. And these boys come and pretty much dismantle this house from the inside out. And here you've had all this worm imagery as you're going along, wondering how this fits in. But the truth is that the entire story has been just slowly them being these little worms who eat this house and destroy it from the inside out, just like a worm destroys an apple. And so is that a canonical work? Based on the plot, based on the characters, I would say absolutely it's going to stand the test of time and continue to be anthologized. Do I see it in our anthology? Gosh darn it, no. But that kind of imagery just has this impression that just sticks with you. And when you keep coming back to think about it, that's what you're stuck with. And so we're going to discuss many more characteristics throughout the term. But one of the biggest measurements of whether a work is canonical or not is, does the work stand the test of time? Shakespeare's plays, we still study them several hundred years later. That is, his plays are canonical works. Even his minor plays are repeated in theaters everywhere. And that's one comment that Mays makes in the introduction to her work, on page 2, is that, there's a reason why we study these people, or why they study, or why we study Dickens, and why we keep going back to the Bronte sisters, and because of the richness and what happens in the play. It's not just the action of the play, but it's the characters and how you become involved in the characters, that stand the test of going through many centuries. One of the reasons why Beowulf is taught still so much in high schools, especially, is because it's not just a play that was written. It's a play that was handed down for centuries. And, if we consider, how many thousands of years that writing has been around versus how many thousands of years that, the spoken word has been around, that epic poem has been sung by bards for thousands of years. And then finally it was written down, and then has been, translated and changed a little bit over the years. But the characters in that, they stand the test of time. Homer's The Iliad, that's another example, and the Odyssey too. Those are both examples of bards handing down a story through the oral tradition for thousands of years, and then finally it was written down, and we have one of the greatest bards who told the story actually offering it. So, I mean, and we still read it, and it's still reenacted. Just a few years ago, actually, it might be more than a few years ago, Brad Pitt, acted in Troy. And that is part of the Homeric epics. We still use it. So things that can stand the test of time, modern works, and we'll talk about this a little bit with the authors and the works that we're going to study in a little bit, but these modern works, if their character development is great, they might be canonical for this time and this culture. Will they stand the test of time long term? I don't know. Only time will tell, honestly, and I probably won't be around to see some of those. Some of those become true canonical works. Some of my favorites, even like Sandra Cisneros, I love her. She's an awesome poet, artist, novelist. Her novels read like poetry. They are so vivid with imagery, and so the chapters are so brief, but they pack so much action and description into them. I'm hoping she'll stand the test of time. She stood a few decades, so that's pretty good. So now you've got on the screen in front of you, these canonical works, these canonical authors. When we mention stories like Beowulf and Homer and Shakespeare and Dickens and Charlotte Bronte or Anne Bronte or Emily Bronte and their works, Eudora Welty, Flannery O'Connor, she has Anne Rice on this presentation. That has been, those works have been read richly for several decades. Will she stand the test of time? And 100 years from now, will Interview with the Vampire be studied as a really well-known work? Already, a lot of students do not know that reference, do not understand Anne Rice, do not understand her witches or her vampire stories. So I don't know. I really don't know. Time will tell again. Toni Morrison has some of the richest works. Judith Ortiz Coffer. Have you ever heard of her before? Well, most of my students have never heard of her because she's not been included in any of the textbooks that they've studied in their high schools. Some of her work tends to be a little more mature, so it is studied in college classrooms a little bit more, but the truth is that most of her works are just fine for the classroom. Dorothy Parker, she was made popular with the Gilmore Girls because of the production company behind that and some of the quips that they had using some of her work, and just the dialogue was based on some of Dorothy Parker's works. And Some folks have just read her like crazy, and some have never ever heard of her. Ralph Ellison is a famous, wonderful African American writer who people might have heard his name, but have they ever read The Invisible Man? Have they ever read The King of the Bingo Game? Those are amazing transformative works that deal with issues of racism. They stood the test of time and culture in the mid 1900s, and they continue to transform uh, American culture for sure. Do they have this test of time? Again, that's our question. Now, to get to some of these later authors, Suzanne Collins, you might know her as the author of Hunger Games. Okay, so she created a great stir in the entertainment world. So here's our division. Is this scholarship or is this entertainment purposes that this author is going to be recognized long term, or are they not? Already, if you look at J.K. Rowling with her Harry Potter stories, you know, people are still reading them. People are still enjoying the movies. The movies are still being made off of it. Will it stand another 50 years? Will it be a book that people go back to in 50 years' time? And if you compare it to the richness of or the development of The Wizard of Oz, in the 20th century is when it gained the real popularity. It really gained some steam, of course, when the movie was made. Is this something that is going to happen for J.K. Rowling? Don't know. Do you even know the name Anthony Burgess, who wrote The Clockwork Orange? That has been a work that has stood the test of time, but I'm finding that so many of my students, it might be on their AP list, but some of them start to get into it and then they just can't continue reading, which I think is very sad. But that story is really creative, really imaginative, really different, and it has a lot of political commentaries in there. But Orwell's 1984, how many people have read that one? Because it's still included in classes, would they pick it up for entertainment purposes? And do you recognize those last couple of names? F. Scott Fitzgerald, Robert Frost. Robert Frost was one of our most celebrated poets in the mid 1900s and 20th century. It's so sad to reference it like that because it's not really been that long ago in the large scale of things. But yeah, Robert Frost is still heavily studied in the high schools and in colleges everywhere as one of the greatest American poets to ever live. Have you ever read his poetry? Most people have. Compare that to County Cullen. Have you ever heard of that name? Um, so you've got to think, okay, are there works? And it's not just that these authors are canonical or that they're works that are, with them, or of course Beowulf. We have no clue who originated that story. It's an anonymous work. You got to think of the author, but you've also got to think of the work and how it fits in. So into the culture long term. So then there come questions of expanding the canon. And truly, the list on the other page involved a lot of ideas of the Western canon. And what is the Western canon? Can I say white? Can I say Anglo-Saxon white males primarily? It's based off of ideas of Greek and Roman philosophy. And I don't mean to really simplify it too much by thinking Anglo-Saxon white males. But for years, that was the truth. Mostly men were in the canon until there was a revival of women's literature works, thanks to Virginia Woolf. A lot of women who had written in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s were completely overlooked and kind of lost in time because people were studying Tennyson, people were studying Shakespeare, people were studying Dickens, people were studying these men who were considered the greats for years, Keats, Yeats, all these people who you're thinking of, or that you've probably seen in your textbooks. They were all white males and primarily from England. But this is also an extremely American and British look. I mean, how many of us have read many French or German or Italian writers outside of how they've been, translated a little bit into our poetry schemes? And and such. It's just not really there um, that much in our traditional classrooms, I should say. So that's what we have had. Virginia Woolf is responsible for reviving a lot of women writers. Jane Austen, I would say that people would consider her to have been canonical for the last couple decades or couple centuries. She wrote in the early 1800s, and she was studied for decades after that, and continues to be studied. And her books have been made into many movies too. However, women studying her, or men studying her, classes studying her, um, that it's been stronger for her than most of the other women. Another couple of names that you might recognize would be Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. They are known primarily in popular culture for their love poetry, and they wrote in the mid 1800s. But Elizabeth Barrett Browning is responsible for writing a lot of anti-slavery and a lot of social poetry that have a storyline and a dramatic purpose to it. She actually was the inspiration for her husband, eventually, Robert Browning, for him actually changing his poetic style. He saw her character development in those poems, and the vividness that she created in her poetry, and he was inspired to change the way that he wrote. But how often are you taught that? No, we usually study Porphyria's Lover or My Last Duchess by Robert Browning in class. We study a couple love poems by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and we move on. So we have to get away from this idea of a canon that just has these authors in it, but we can't forget them either. They are canonical. They are great for many reasons, and we continue study them for many reasons. So having this Western canon, we can't get rid of it. We can't get rid of that idea. But what happened throughout American history in particular to other people? For example, minorities, whether minority by race, minority by gender. We've already talked about some of the female poets, but Charlotte Gilman Perkins, or Perkins Gilman, who we are going to study the Yellow Wallpaper in this class, she has been a remarkable person who changed the field of psychology and even questioned the medical profession during the late 1800s and early 1900s. That one work did it. And I mean, if it weren't for other people really studying her impact, would she still be a work, or would the Yellow Wallpaper still be a work that is studied heavily? But that also brings into question people of other races. I mean, Frederick Douglass is well known in classes because he had a historical influence in American society. He was a contemporary of Abraham Lincoln, and he went and talked with Abraham Lincoln about slavery issues, and he went to Washington several times, and he wrote prolifically, even at the potentially cost of his life. He was an African American former slave who was fighting and who freed himself, and then who was able to start writing for the abolitionist cause. So these ideas of well, why would we read him, but we might not read other African American artists during that time, may not even know any of the names during that time, because there was a long period of legal racism in the country. And what is worth studying? White, Black, Asian, Irish, you name the group, and keep this in mind. I said white, and then I said Irish separately. For a long time, the Irish and the Italians were considered a separate race from whites, from Caucasians, but they are white, they are Caucasian, but they're just a different nationality and a different group that was considered lower than another political group and another, racial national group for so long that a lot of their works were overlooked and seen as folklore or lesser in value. So people still question, well, we're a pretty integrated society now, and the racial issues just aren't there as strongly as they used to be. If I go back to the previous slide, how many of these people did you know were Latina authors? Or without just looking at their name and going, must be another nationality, must be Latina just by the name alone. Or how many of these people are African American? Would you know that just by looking at Ralph Ellison's name without understanding who he was beyond that? So we've got to think about those things and how long it has taken to actually integrate minorities into American society for people to actually read beyond just a scholarly basis. I mean, first it had to, well, not first necessarily, it had to integrate the universities, it had to integrate popular culture. Those works had to become something that was passed around and looked at and studied for entertainment value or for real literary value. How on earth does that happen in a country that is so polarized racially? So it's taken through the civil rights movement probably another 20 or 30 years to really get some of these names integrated into the culture strongly. And it's taken another 10 years or so to make people open up a textbook that has different races in it. We start out with Sherman Alexie, who's Native American. Would he have been studied 70 years ago? No. Well, first of all, wasn't alive. Second, I mean, he's just one of those groups that had been marginalized for so many years, for more than a century of our nation's culture. That why on earth would people include him? And then the next thing, and by the way, those folks who would question why would we include him are missing so much by not reading him. His characters are so intriguing. They're not just fun. They're not just different. They just captivate uh, throughout the work. You want to keep reading, and so he has strong visual presence in his works, and he has strong characters who are sometimes just laugh out loud funny. You just have to love them. But world literatures, what place would world literatures have, and why is that necessary? Well, because we're talking about a global society now. The internet over the last 2 decades has just changed the world. Everybody gets to talk, everybody gets to understand their connectedness in the world if they choose to get out of the Western canon, if they choose to get outside of, the borders of the country and actually read works that are from China, from Japan, that are not just assigned, but just are that you just pick up and you read. So fortunately, most of the intro to literature textbooks anymore include people who are from Arabic background or Arabic speaking language background and have either been translated or are bi or tri or multilingual, who are able to communicate a wonderful story. How will their works work into the Western canon? And I go back to this separate or same canon for women and other nationalities. Should there be a women's literature canon? Should there be a separate women's canon from the Western general canon? I say no. Absolutely, they need to be integrated. But at the same time, if you are just looking at women writers, who would be the ones who you would study, and why would or wouldn't those people make it into the Western canon to be studied as well? But world literature wise, man, we have a number. I mean, Tolstoy. How can you get away from that name? Great Russian writer, and Guy de Maupassant. And I mean, we just have so many examples of people coming from all around the world and contributing to literature, contributing to the movies and American culture that It's not realistic anymore. And a great example, and to take you away from literature one more time, would be in the movies with Bollywood. Slumdog Millionaire. Yeah, some people say it's a little too westernized, but Bollywood is a world power in the movie business, and those stories are absolutely going around the world and come from literature, come from great literature, come from great movies, come from other places, and they're changing the way that artists who are traditionally more Western are looking at their craft of writing and storytelling. So this is why it's so important to say, yeah, do we separate? Do we keep them over here? Do we categorize and generalize them over here and to the side, or do we integrate everything? And I think the truth is that we need a real balanced approach to looking at, do we expand or do we not expand the canon? And then we have this idea of what on earth is this technology going to do? One of the first stories that you would read in the shorter 11th edition in May's text is the Shabbat, which is written by a woman who is from Iran, and this is more of a graphic story than anything else. So where do graphic novels and where do comics fit into the literary canon, or do they? Or do they need their separate canon, or do they not? So we're not just looking at, race or nationality or those kinds of things as to what makes something canonical, but, different inventions change the way that we look at literature. And just think about this. What did the written word do to change story writing, or storytelling, we should say? Story writing changed storytelling because then you had a little more static presence. And how did it change, the way that people told stories? It did dramatically. And then you have a writing or there, but how did the printing press in the mid 1400s, how did that change literature? How did that change storytelling and writing? No longer did you have people who would handwrite, or monks who would handwrite books and texts and then get it distributed. You had a lower cost associated with being able to purchase the books, and no longer were the rich literate and the commoners illiterate. You had a large scale development of literacy happen just with the invention of the printing press. So there are so many things that influence and are going to continue to influence us with this computer, with this thing called the computer, and how we interact with videos and texts and software and everything else that's going to change literature, going to change the way that we storytell along the years. So to sum up, what we're going to do throughout the class is ask these questions. What is the canonical value of this work? So you will study it not just on a characteristic of character and plot and imagery and all of these other things, but you're also going to look at this on how does it stand the test of time, and how, what are the components of this that make this book rich or real or valuable? What would I consider the value of this work to be? And you're going to ask yourself, would I consider this work canonical, or would it be a read for pleasure? Or again, remember, let's think about, do those things have to be separate, or could you justify your answer with both of them? Of course. And then the why. When you're answering any questions in here, always consider whether it's for discussion in class, whether it's for a paper or for a journal assignment, whatever, ask the question why, and offer examples with that, because that is going to explain the reasons behind justifying the stance that you're taking. So I hope that this has been an interesting look at and helping you understanding what the literary canon is. Too often I think we get lost in the terminology and don't really think about what the implication is about understanding what the canon is, or some of these other terms that we're studying throughout the semester. But this is an important one. This is one that would appear on exams, that would absolutely be great for including in discussion questions or in just in the essays that you'll write. You know, if you can address those kinds of ideas about the literary canon and think about how people evaluate works, then you're going to do fine in this literature class. Thank you and blessings.